Well, look, it's going to be more me today
Okay.
because I'm not as in tune, I guess, or whatever, as the other guys.
Hmm.
But first, I want to ask a question that my son asked, and that was Jesus a rabbi or what?
Um, well, I think not in the traditional sense
It
that he
wasn't in the order of rabbis or whatever for Israel.
no, but he was known as a rabbi because he was a teacher, and his teaching recognized, and therefore the disciples treated him as a rabbi because they followed him. So when it was like, "Come follow me," that was not just a out of the blue thing. If we said to someone in the street, "Oh, come and follow me," they would have no idea what we're on about. Where am I following you? What do you want me to go? Because it would all be about where you're going. Whereas actually follow me for them meant follow my lifestyle. Because that's what a rabbi really did, presented a lifestyle in such a way that people um, saw that he was teaching them how to live from the understanding of the law, or the prophets, or the tablet, all of it, really. We just don't get that we don't have that. We don't even have a concept of it in the Western world. So it's quite difficult to see exactly what they were, looking to, what they knew and what we don't. But they obviously saw him as a rabbi. Now, I don't think the religious institution wanted to recognize him as a rabbi because that would have validated what he was doing. So it was probably the people recognized him as a rabbi and therefore followed him in that way. Of course, until he said something they didn't like, then they all disappeared off, and it was only the disciples left. It's like, well, are you going to leave me? Well, where else have we going to go? You've got the words of eternal life. So they understood the context of what he was really sharing. So I would say, from whose perspective you're looking at, from that, one wouldn't have thought he was a rabbi and one would have. And I'm not sure. So the rabbis were not necessarily connected to the synagogue system in the same way that the benches of three would have been, and that type of thing, because they were almost like a sort of more of a traveling type ministry that discipled people into following their particular stream. So you had people like Gamaliel, who was known as a rabbi, and he's quoted as saying, hey, giving some wisdom to them at the time. So they obviously listened to him because he was talking to the high priest and everything, and they're saying, well, if this is of God, then you don't want to oppose it. But if it's not of God, it will fall away. So you don't really need to do anything. But they didn't listen to him because they kept on persecuting them. So, I don't think they had in any official capacity. Only those that followed them would come under their teaching and therefore guidance by voluntary willingness to do so. But it was quite a big thing. I mean, normally you wouldn't have been accepted by a rabbi unless you had memorized the whole of the Old Testament. For us, law, prophets, whatever. And can you imagine today someone memorizing and being able to debate the whole of every scripture in the Old Covenant? Well, I guess, they didn't have TVs and, other distractions that we do, and they saw it as a vital part of their whole cultural existence. So all of them would have at least had a pretty good knowledge. It's not like today where someone in the street might have never even read the Bible, or, they would have all been part of a synagogue, and they would have all had scriptures, and they would have all tried to memorize them and learn them. Now, I don't know whether they, how they did it, whether they went, I haven't looked into it in that detail, but, in a sense, when they said teacher, that was the sort of recognition that he had, from the people, at least, anyway. So, yeah.
That's interesting.
You know,
You often wonder too what he did before he, before he started teaching.
absolutely, yeah. And I think there's certainly indication in terms of Mary, his mother, when she said, look, do what he says, that he had obviously done some things that had warranted her faith that he could change water into wine. You know, I mean, who would imagine that Jesus could do something about that? You know, if they didn't know him and he hadn't had some track record of doing things, you know, in his life, you know, she was the closest obviously to him. So she obviously had some indication that he could do some things. But obviously we don't have them recorded. So in that sense, obviously either we're not supposed to have them recorded. It does say also that he grew in wisdom and stature with God and man. So there was a process. Did he really understand everything about his call until he got to the age of responsibility? Then he's like, well, I must be about my Father's business, you know, in the temple. And he started teaching them stuff, which they were like, whoa, where is he coming from, type of thing. So, you know, was that, I don't believe it was supernaturally imparted. I don't believe it was, I believe he learned that through the process of pursuing relationship with God himself. Otherwise, how could he grow in wisdom and stature with God and man? It also says, I think in Hebrews, where he learned obedience. So what does that mean? You know, he learned obedience. Well, does that mean that he wasn't obedient? No, because if he wasn't obedient, then but obedient to what? Because he certainly wasn't obedient to the traditions of men. He didn't have a problem in picking the ears of corn, you know, and they were like, you can't do that. And they said, why not? You know, so he was sort of like, well, the law's for man. Man's not here to serve the law. You know, so there was a sense where he really did challenge some of the perceptions, preconceived ideas. They thought it was a scandal that he was hanging out with the riffraff from their perspective, because they didn't, because they would have been polluted from their perspective. So there was a sort of a huge difference, I think, in terms of how all that worked out. You know, for me, I mean, I have sort of talked to him about it, because when looking at discipleship and looking at the training of the seven spirits of God and wisdom and everything else, he had that available to him. And it talks about in Isaiah that morning by morning you wake me with the tongue of disciples, that he was being discipled on a daily basis. By who? Well, for me, it would be the seven spirits of God and wisdom and his Father and everything else. And so seemingly that he did grow in that and didn't just have a download. Because if he had a download, how could we possibly be expected to do what he did, the way he did it, if we don't get a download? It wouldn't be fair, would it? It would be like, well, it's okay for you. You got a download. We've got to read the Bible. And we've got to try and sort this out. And, well, you just had a download of everything. Well, yes, but he was the living word. But I do believe there was a sense where he learned to apply that to a human existence, which he didn't have before. You know, he didn't have a human existence before. So there was something in which that human existence, where as the Son of Man, he represented us fully. And I don't think if he had a download and everything was just downloaded and he didn't have to learn and he didn't have to practice like we do, then it wouldn't really represent us, would it? You know, and I think he represented us fully. You know, and so when he was like in the Garden of Gethsemane and it's like, you know, let this cup pass from me and all that, he wasn't there as the Son of God. He knew he was going to the cross. He was there taking on us, being us, and taking on the humanity of it, fully representing us, taking on the weight of all of the rubbish from humanity. I mean, can you imagine that? No wonder he was sweating great drops of blood, because he hadn't done any of that himself, but he was going to go to the cross bearing everything for us, carrying our sin and sorrow and sickness and everything else. So was that real? Well, it seemed to be pretty much real, of him having to take that on board. And then wow, this is just overwhelming from the perspective of his humanity. But of course, he was, he was obviously committed to going to the cross from his position as the Son of God. But if he didn't go as the Son of Man, then he wouldn't be representing us fully. So there was something, I think, the weight that he carried in the garden was an emotional coming to terms with humanity's lostness, and therefore carrying that lostness. And I think that's what he was feeling. Though when it was like, my God, why have you forsaken me? It wasn't that God had forsaken him. He was crying our cry because he took on the weight of our lostness, and it was the sort of, the Psalm, 24, was it 22, where essentially at the end of that, it was obviously, well, you haven't forsaken me. So the whole Psalm, rather than just that one verse, needs to be taken into context. But I do believe there's a sense where he was crying our cry. And it wasn't the sort of the cry of those who knew God. It was the cry of those who didn't know God. And were like, well, where are you? Type of thing. Well, we know he's always there. It's just you're not necessarily engaging with it or fulfilling it in that sense of that relationship. So, yeah, I think it's I'll have to have another chat to him about it. I'm sort of seeing, okay, well, give me some insight. But sometimes he doesn't give you what you want. You get what you need to get. Which is keep some of the mystery in it. I think there's always going to be some mystery in what he did, because if we had to go into that, then we would be going through the same thing, and he's taken that from us, so we don't need to go through the same thing. So I think it's very unlikely that we're ever going to really fully understand or appreciate exactly what he went through, because he went through it so we don't have to. It'd be pointless if we had to go through it all. So some of it, you just got to trust his love and what he went through accomplished what he needed to accomplish. And I'm quite happy to trust him and don't need a demonstration. Thank you very much. Because when I went through my dark cloud experience and I was having to sort of let go of all my dreams and ketubah things, it felt like there were waves of anguish rolling over me in grief and sorrow. And that was just like this tiny little bit for my life. And think of that he took for the whole of humanity. The weight of that is just unimaginable, really. My little bit felt like the end of everything to me. I was the end of my rope, having just sort of faced laying down all the things that I, felt that I was called to do and grieving over them. And yet he took on the whole grief, sorrow, and the weight of the whole of humanity on him to die our death, which is pretty, amazing. And knowing how much he loves me, I think that gives me a clue to how he loves the world. Yeah. So, yeah.
I guess a big difference too would be that he didn't have all the garbage or baggage in his thinking and all that, because he was part of God. Where if you think back, I was thinking as you were talking, if you went back like to where you were 9 or 10 and you're freed up and you're thinking like you have been in the last couple of years, what a difference it would have made in how you were able to process stuff. You wouldn't be off cruising hay and stubble all the time and everything else, and going off in pursuits going nowhere.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I think looking at that, he did say that the enemy had nothing in him. So the enemy had nothing on him in that sense. So there was no generational thing on him. He fulfilled all righteousness. So there was a sense where there wasn't the lostness of identity that we have. But I do believe that he had to learn to know who he was, not just have a download of who he was from immediately. I think there was a process. Otherwise, he couldn't have grown in stature with God and man, or wisdom and stature. How could he do it if there wasn't a process? You don't grow in something if you get it as an automatic. So there's something of his discipling, learning his relationship with God, learning all that stuff, embracing it, which was part of the process he went through. Why was he put in obscurity in a discipleship process for 18 years? Because he was, when he burst onto the scene at 12 years old in the temple and started teaching, it's like then he goes into an apprenticeship effectively in a human sense for the next 18 years before he then comes back onto the scene, and starts drawing people to himself. What was he doing, as you say, in that 18 years? Did he do miracles? Did he do, I guess I think he did, but not in a public way to draw attention to himself, because it wasn't yet his time, which is even what he said to his mother. Well, it's not my time. And God had a pretty interesting father sort of, well, you can do it now. 30 seconds later, when he says, well, it's not my time, he must have had some communication with the father to say, well, go ahead and do it. Otherwise he would have not done it, would he? He would have said, well, it's my time. I told you it's not my time. Well, something changed in that moment that then he was, okay, I'm going to respond and turn the water into wine. Which was a pretty good place to start, wasn't it? When it comes to miracles, it was quite a sort of, whoa, this is a big one. But on the other side of it, an odd place to start too. Turning water into, it's not in the grand scheme of things. Someone running out of wine in a wedding doesn't seem to have an awful lot of eternal impact, does it? But he did it, But I guess people were still following him at that point. There's something, it was at the very beginning of his public ministry. And so I guess the timeline of it would be interesting to go back and look and see, okay, that was after his baptism and the declaration out of heaven. Because obviously John's gospel is slightly different chronologically than the other gospels, because it's not written from a historical perspective but a relational one. So you certainly had John the Baptist there, talking about certain things, but yeah, it's an interesting, the life of Jesus and everything else is interesting to see some of these things, because I think those that don't see his humanity and just see him as God miss out on the reality that he was tempted in all points like we were, yet without sin. It wasn't just like an automatic thing for him. Otherwise it would be, well, if there isn't a choice involved, how could he not make the choice that Adam made? So there must have been a choice every point, like obviously with the temptation in the wilderness. If that temptation wasn't real, then what would be the point of it? If there would have been no opportunity for him to actually say, okay, I'm hungry, bread would be quite useful, there would have been no point in the temptation. It wouldn't have had any meaning. The meaning comes in the fact that he said no to doing a shortcut or taking a shortcut into any of the things of receiving the kingdom. So, at the beginning of his ministry, he's in the wilderness, the devil's tempting him, and, here's all the kingdoms of the earth, and I'll give you all these if you bow down to me. Well, it takes him to resurrection day to receive those kingdoms, because he went before the Ancient of Days, and the Ancient of Days gave him the kingdom. So it took him all that period of going through that and of going through the cross and the resurrection to get to the point, to the outworking of that, when the enemy offered it to him in an instant in the wilderness. So I think he chose, each step of the way to make the right choice and not to make the wrong choices that we made. So, you get this sort of impression that what was offered, and it's sort of described as, the fruit of the eyes and that's there's three things there, which I guess, corresponded to the Genesis account of Eve's, making a wrong choice and Adam choosing to follow her, that he undid there in the wilderness. It's the same sort of temptation that he faced. And made the right choice.
He must have known when he was in the wilderness anyway what he would have had to go through.
I think there was a sense where he was recognizing, what was he doing for fasting for 40 days? He must have been engaging in intimacy with the Father in those 40 days, it wasn't just, well, he's going to be hungry and wandering around doing nothing. There must have been a point where he went into the wilderness voluntarily to take on that 40-day process. And 40 days is the sort of testing period. 40, as we say, 40 years in the wilderness and 40 days, that seemed to be the testing period that he embraced and chose to embrace it. Because I think he had to undo everything Adam did, otherwise he wasn't going to be able to deal with the reality of representing those choices on the cross and carrying those choices for mankind's choices, not his own. But I do believe it was a genuine temptation, as within the garden it was a genuine anguish of soul. Which I think all the more, in a sense, shows the depth of love and willingness to embrace our lostness so that we would not perish or be lost again. And take on our lost image, the image of sonship, which is why I think he cried in our sonship, because we lost it. And so he was representing us fully in every way.
It's interesting too how Paul went away. He go away for a period of time, number of years too.
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone goes through periods of testing in their lives. Certain things happen. You have choices to make. Are you going to accept that call to this, or are you going to be willing to, represented obviously by Abraham and sort of the choice to leave everything behind and follow me. And, then you get that sort of repeated with the rich young ruler, give everything away and follow me. There's a sense where there was a parallel there to Abraham's willingness to do that and the rich young ruler's sorrow in having to do that, which was a testing of his willingness to embrace the process of following, which is discipleship, really. So you do have those things that you can see. And in my own life, there have been periods where I guess, having gone through the 40-day fast and then going through the dark cloud experience, all those things were contributory to the process of transformation and maturity and everything else. And, the willingness to embrace it and to go through it produced fruit. If I'd avoided it, then God would have had to have brought me through something else to produce that fruit, because I needed the fruit. I needed to be trusted in being faithful to whatever he was calling me to do. So everyone has different things. I mean, I think when someone's called, it always tends to create a crisis of faith. Can I do this? Is it possible to do this? Am I hearing you right? All of those things sort of are part of the process that we face when faced with a challenge of leaving things behind. The same thing would be, imagine those people who are called to go to Africa or Indonesia or somewhere or whatever. There must be am I hearing you right? Are you really? Is this you? Can I do this? Am I capable of doing it? I've never done this before. Same thing for me when I was working in a hospital. Knowing that I had a call on my life, but not really understanding it fully. Then when God says, well, I want you to move, well, what did I do? Well, I decided to move, but it wasn't without a cost in sense of, I'd never really done anything like that before, and I never had that sort of choice before, although there were a few sort of preliminary tests, I guess, along the way. But primarily it was like, okay, I'm asking you to move your whole family to another part of the country to plant something and do something that you've never done before, which was like, okay. And then with a whole list of sort of, hey, and here's some of the things I want you to know about this before you go. But I said yes. I'm still here 20 odd years later, sort of still out working that choice and decision to say yes. along the way, were there times when I wish I'd said no? Yeah, if I'm honest, it's like, dealing with people, who are really ungrateful at times and really only see them things from their selfish, self-centered perspectives and don't realize the cost it is to do certain stuff. And, the betrayal that you go through when people basically stab you in the back. And, I remember having a meal with a couple. My wife and I had a meal with a couple who were elders he was an elder in the church. They were friends, and they said to us, "Oh, can we have a meal with you? Can we get together for lunch?" So yeah, we invited them around for lunch. They came around, we had lunch with them, and then they said, "Oh, we're leaving." Just like that, out of the blue. I don't know where the relationship went. I don't know where the discussion went. And then we discovered they were trying to take half of the church with them. So those things, it's like, okay, you have to forgive them and bless them, release them. There's no point hanging on to it. I find that a little bit easier than my wife did at the time, because she was invested much more in the emotion of it. And I'm like, okay, well, if that's the way they are, well, bless them. I'll be better without them in that, because if that's what relationship is. But it does hurt, and it's being wounded by people, being betrayed by people is not an easy thing, and you have to deal with it. And a lot of people face that. When you think someone's a real friend and then they essentially act as if they're not. And I'm a very trusting sort of person. I'm not suspicious of people. I don't want to be suspicious of people, so I trust them at face value. And yeah, I could look into things spiritually, but I'd never feel really that I want to do that, or I feel led to do that. So you trust people, and if they get it wrong, then you forgive them and bless them and try and restore things. But if they decide they're going to leave, like that, it's a challenge. And in points like that, you get to the, am I really happy that I made that decision all these years ago? I wouldn't have had to go through all this heartache at times, because most of it's for people. And my children, they saw all that, and that really turned them off church, because they saw what we invested, sometimes to their detriment, when we, kept seeing people when they wanted, and they're phoning us up, and we're there on call to see people and all that sort of stuff. And our kids are like, seeing how people treated us, they didn't like it. And they were like, well, if this is what it's about, I don't really want that. So it's real. These things are real, and that's just, thinking of that is just nothing compared to what Jesus did. Because he took on the whole nation, didn't he? And represented them, and they rejected him and said, crucify him. And, when he was only there to try and bring them into a relationship with the Father, and take away the sin of the world. And yet they were crucifying him, and mocking him, and, beating him, and eventually, praise God, I haven't had to go through quite that, in a way, but you go through your own situations which are painful and difficult, and you have to face them, and and the criticism and all the stuff and everything you get accused of, which you haven't done, and some things probably you had done, and you have to own that and deal with that. But it's not an easy thing, and I think for everybody, the cost of following Jesus into the fullness of our inheritance is significant for some people, and I think we've got to take that into account.
Would you think of that with relationships now at the church? I remember back at the airport, pastors coming in. I think the most common thing I heard from pastors, you talked to them later, was they didn't like their congregations. They just hated them. I guess some of the problems they've been through. But going back to where you are today and where you were back then, are you different in relationships because of that, or how you see them, or even how you run around if someone calls you? Like back then, you're probably a lot more bigger. Now you probably see it differently.
Well, I think for me, going through a process of of dealing with father wounds and emotional wounds was part of my journey. And the healing of those wounds and the removing of the scars of those wounds. When I was in heaven in 2010, and Jesus said, well, you've got a father wound, and I'm like, well, I don't, I've dealt with it all, but the scar was still there. Now that scar, I think, held me back relationally. I guarded myself because I had been affected emotionally by people. And that was not a good thing, but it's a protection mechanism that a lot of people have because you don't want to keep getting hurt. So you in some way guard your heart, and therefore you're not as open as you could have been. So when my emotions really God started to work on me emotionally, some of those issues started to come to the forefront. And this is a long time ago, which was preparation for him really dealing with the core issue in me, which was his father heart and my lack of sonship. So there was a lot of preparation that went on over the years to get me to a point where I would allow him to remove that scar, because that scar was a reminder that kept me safe. It's like, hey, let's keep these people at a particular distance because they might hurt you. Now I'm not saying that's a conscious thing, but it was there. And therefore, even when I was with people, there was a sense where I still felt alone. There was a sense where I could be in a small group of people or a group of people and feel alone or feel isolated, even in a group. Now I was committed to being open and honest. So I never hid things from people. And I was prepared to share my story with people along the way. So it wasn't that type of thing, but there was a sense where I wouldn't let them in. I don't mind telling them stuff, but maybe I'm not going to let them really in there in that way. So then when, he removed that scar, the next day, Jesus said, and now will you let me deal with your wounds of betrayal? So I'm like, yeah, okay. And he brought back to mind, I think, 14 different occasions in my life where I'd been betrayed by people. And I went through the emotion of that again, because I really had to deal with it properly and let him heal the wounds. So it wasn't like hey, take this all away. This was, okay, will you let me take this away? Remembering what it cost you. That was quite a hard thing, but it went back to when I was 12 years of age, and there was a situation that happened with a couple of friends. When I got to secondary school age, I went to a different town because I passed my 11 plus, which was a grammar school entrance exam, and I went to grammar school. Whereas most of my friends didn't pass, and they went to the secondary model school in my town. And so I had to go to 10 miles to another town to go to school every day. And what happened was, like, there were a couple of friends who also passed, and we became friends, and we used to hang out. And my dad was a builder, one of the other guys' dads was a builder, and we decided we were going to make something. So it's like, hey, bring your tools, borrow some tools, we're going to make this trolley thing. Now a trolley thing was like a cart that you had pram wheels and you sort of raced down hills with, basically. So we were going to make this. We found this plan. It was a red and blue thing. And 2 weeks, we arranged a couple of weeks' time, that we were going to get together on a Saturday morning. We're going to make this thing. So when it came around, went up there, took the tools with me, went up there, they opened the shed, and there was the trolley that they had made without me. Now, on the surface, I was a little bit like, oh, okay, didn't really sort of say much, but it really affected me, and I felt betrayed, but didn't know how to deal with it, so I just made light of it and didn't deal with it. But actually the reality was I made a judgment on that situation that was a little bit like a sort of putting a flag up saying, oh, betray me for the rest of my life, because I didn't know how to forgive them. And I obviously judged that this wasn't good. And it made me, of course, suspicious of people wanting to be my friends. So from that point on, and this, you sort of see these dynamics when you sort of look back, then from that point on, I always befriended the new guy at school. So I always befriended them, rather than have friends from people who could let me down. So I always befriended the new guy. So there were 2 or 3 guys who ended up coming to school in various stages, and I befriended them and made friends with them and whatever, because that seemed more of a safer option. So all those dynamics sort of are in place in your life, and it had created in me I am open to a degree, but you're not getting any deeper, and that was a protection mechanism with my wife and children, because I got hurt when I was sort of teenager, first love type experiences, got hurt, let down again, vowed I'm not going to be hurt like that again, put protection mechanisms up. So, I became very emotionally withdrawn, and I wouldn't let people in. So then God sort of says, okay, I want to heal your father wound. Now I'm going to heal your betrayal wounds. So now I want you not to be fearful of relationships, but be open. So that's what happened. And I don't think I would be talking to people like I do if I hadn't had those things dealt with. Because, I didn't want relationships like that with people, So I'm very happy in my office, preparing messages to go and bring on a Sunday. And I don't really, I'll minister to people, but I don't want the emotional thing with it. But that changed, and it caused me to be able to invest myself and not be closed or needing to protect myself. Now, that, of course, that makes you open and vulnerable to people letting you down and betraying your trust and stabbing you in the back and whatever. And, there have been some occasions where that's happened, but I've dealt with them very differently, in that I choose to forgive them, I release them, I bless them. And it doesn't mean I'm going to enter back into necessarily the same level of relationship with them, but I'm not carrying anything against them. And you have to deal with that. And that's the reality of, I guess, being in relationship with other people. So I think over the last 8 years, particularly or 9 years really, since 2010, God has done a continual process of working with me, working in my emotions, looking to deal with how you handle conflict and people issues and being let down and disappointed and that sort of stuff. In that, I know that I'm loved by him. That to me trumps anything else. So people do something, I know he loves me, so it ain't going to affect how I feel about myself when someone does anything damaging or harmful, or they criticize me or make judgments about me, or because we put out some pretty controversial stuff out there, so potentially there's all sorts of people can say all sorts of negative things, which I've legislated against a lot of that, but bottom line is people still do say stuff, but it doesn't affect me in a negative way. I just bless them. And because, hey, what God thinks about me is more important than anyone else. I don't have a reputation that I'm trying to maintain. It was one of the big things that God did in dealing with me. I don't need a reputation. It's like I just need to know I'm loved and want to demonstrate that love to other people through who I am. So it's been a long journey of emotionally becoming whole and not being affected by the past. Now, I'm sure there's still other things that God is doing and will need to do, and and I'm up for that process. And you still have to face every time something does negative happen. You've got to keep your emotions in check. You've got to make sure you don't let your emotions rule you, and you've got to, but not suppress them and not deal with them. You've got to be real in it. And there are real hurts, and there are people who let you down, and there are people who break your trust, and then you have to face, okay, how do I deal with that? Well, I forgive them and I release them and I want to bless them, but I'm not necessarily going to give them my back to stab. So things change, but you've got to make sure you don't get cynical or skeptical or those negative emotions.
It's pretty
or
hard
judgmental.
developing expectations. So,
Yeah.
you know, even low expectations of here, like because it repeats itself.
Well, it does, but I want to have good expectations of people. You know, I want to have high expectations because that's what God's got.
When it happens.
Well, when it happens, you have to then deal with it. You know, I don't want to get cynical and therefore not trust anybody. You know, I trust people, but I'm also realistic to know that people don't always, because they've got their own stuff and they're going through their own journey and their own process. You know, so you've got to work this out in reality. You know, there's no, you know, sort of avoiding going through a process of transformation and working this out in reality. You know, that's just the way it is. But when you know you're loved by God, everything else really pales into insignificance to the level of that love, which is why we need intimacy with the Father, why we need that level of intimacy, because then that overcomes everything else and it trumps everything else, really. Because if God loves me and people reject me, well, God's love will outweigh anyone's rejection. But you have to get to that point. You know, for a lot of people, they may not got to that point, so they're still influenced or affected by things which, you know, as we mature, we may not be as affected by. But you've got to deal with it. You can't bury it or try and ignore it or deny it. You know, you have to deal with it in reality, and that's obviously not easy. You know, and then, you know, what's the ongoing relationship like when trust has been broken? You have to weigh that, you know. Now, if I don't want a relationship with somebody, then I really haven't dealt with it. But that relationship probably won't be the same as it was before, because trust has to be developed. And when your trust has been broken, you've got to see that trust restored, you know. And of course, most people aren't willing to work through the process. So usually relationships get broken, and that ends the situation. But that's not the ideal. The ideal is you can find restoration. But restoration has to be worked through. And so it's no point being blasé about it. Oh, it doesn't really matter. It does. You know, relationships do matter. And when you've been let down and different things and sort of betrayed or been, you know, your trust has been broken, you have to resolve that and deal with it. You know, if a person keeps on doing it, then effectively the relationship that you have with them is not going to be what it was. You know, but hopefully, yeah.
You now, when you look at things, you're looking at, for example, when things go south, that you're always looking at some form of reconciliation, and then that person's restoration. Where before it was get away.
Yes, I mean, for me, that has to be, because that's how Jesus has treated us.
Yeah.
You know, every time we do something, he doesn't say, "Oh, well, that's it. You've had your chance." You know, he's always continually looking for restoration of relationship and reconciliation within relationships, and therefore, you know, that's the ideal. Does the ideal always ever get outworked? No, because there are two people to part in that, and where one might be looking for that, the other might not. So that's why I think it says, "Be at peace with all men as much as it be possible for you." You can't determine what the other person's going to do. But you've got to maintain a real honesty and openness about it. You know, and I've been going through some of this recently with somebody that I didn't think was going to betray my trust, but did. And it's therefore changed all sorts of things going on here. And you have to then say, okay, what does that mean going on? And do I want a restoration and reconciliation of that relationship? Yes, and I'm at work at looking at that. But am I aware that whatever that person's going through may not, for their perspective, be the same as mine. Yeah. And, they may not, in a sense, deal with the situation the same way as I do. And I've got to accept that. That's where they are in their journey. And I won't hold it against them. But, I'm not going to necessarily, give them the opportunity of stabbing me again. And so you've got to wear the balance of making sure that you've forgiveness and you genuinely want them to be blessed, but you also don't want them to cause any more damage in the situation to you or other people. And, other people also get involved when someone does something that breaks trust. And some of them, those people are caught up in the scenario of what goes on. It's not an easy thing, but you've got to try and maintain a good heart and keep your heart right and keep your heart loving. But love doesn't just tolerate things. Love wants the best. Doesn't keep a record of wrongs, but still wants the best. And where it isn't the best, then that has to be a process you work through. If the other person doesn't go through that process themselves and are still operating out of the same stuff they were before, then you are going to be sensitive to that, and be aware of it, and not going to be gullibly saying, okay, I'll just accept everything then at face value. You're going to be more discerning. Is love discerning? Yes. But love thinks the best. So love doesn't think the worst of people, it thinks the best. So your discernment in it is sort of preempted by love. And then when the worst happens, you then have to apply love to it. So, I don't want to go around being discerning and therefore having a wrong view of people and not trusting people, or not, there's a sort of due diligence in a relationship, but I don't want to be suspicious or skeptical, because that doesn't help a relationship. So I'd rather be demonstrating love than, in a sense, trying to be discerning about everything and therefore suspicious, because I think some of it comes out of hurt rather than out of wisdom. But people have to deal with these sort of situations the way they do.
Based on that, could you ever see anyone as your enemy? Or no?
No, not really.
So.
It's not. I've never really been that way inclined. And even now, where people do things or don't do things, or people say things or whatever, I never see them as my enemy. I see them as, mostly they are obviously brothers and sisters in God, family members, effectively, even though they may not be acting.
How about even if they weren't Christian? Could you see people?
Well, because those people are being manipulated for someone else's purpose and influenced. So, does God see any of us as enemies? No, because he's already ministered reconciliation and reconciled the whole world and not counted anyone's sin against them. So I think there's a measure where we've got to not count people's things against them. But obviously you're not going to enter necessarily into a covenant relationship, as a bench of three with someone that you've not done due diligence with. But even if you do, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of you aren't going to go through a process of change and transformation. It's going to bring things into the light, and blind self areas get brought up, and you have to work them through relationally. And for me, that's what I've looked to do. But relationships do change when things happen negatively, and you just have to accept that, but with a desire that reconciliation will take place. Now, what generally happens is people move away. They withdraw from that. Either they leave the church or they whatever, because they don't really want to work through the consequences of their behaviors in a real and practical way. So they run. from dealing with it and go somewhere else. So you never really have to work that through generally. But we have situations here that I think we've worked through successfully. And relationship has been restored and trust is restored and everything else. Because I think that's really what God wants us to do,
Which is the same with a bench and a ecclesia, because you have to have open relationships, and
yeah,
or else you will never come to an open heaven.
That's right. The key then comes to, well, what happens if you thought those relationships were more open than they are, or they were open from your side of it more than somebody else? You can't, you've got to deal with that, but you can't make someone, they're on their own journey. And, this is why I don't think God wants us to know everything about someone from what God knows, because what would we do with that? I think it's a relational thing, that when things come up relationally, you deal with them as openly and honestly, by not hiding what you're feeling or not burying what you're feeling, but dealing with what you're feeling and being honest. So when someone broke trust with me and let me down and let us down, I had to say, look, this is how I'm feeling. I'm feeling let down. I'm feeling that you betrayed my trust. That's how I'm feeling. Am I going to hold that against you? No, but I need to tell you this is how I'm feeling. And that's the reality of what I was feeling. No, I forgive the person, I release them, I bless them, and I'm looking for God to bring healing to me and my emotions over it. But I'm not going to bury the fact, because that actually then presents an opportunity of that person saying, okay, I own that, and I'll look to deal with my part of why I did that. Because I am very open. I don't need to hide things or pretend. So if I'm struggling at home, I'll say I'm struggling at home. If we have an issue, I'll say it. If we have family issues, I'll say. Because I want accountability, and I want to also share my life with people. If it isn't real, then it's not real relationship. And if I'm only going to share things to a level of, well, this is what I'm prepared to share at a business level, or, well, here's the church stuff I'm prepared to share, and not really share my life, then that's not real. But you can only choose to do that yourself. You can't demand someone does that in return. You would hope they do. And if they don't, you would look to help them by not being judgmental or critical about and model it. And as far as I'm concerned, I've tried to model openness and honesty and transparency and been real about it. And you find that not everyone is as open and honest and as transparent as you are, in spite of the modeling, and that's their stuff. What I'm trying not to let it do is affect how I'm going to be with future people. So, okay, well, I've been burnt by that situation. The next time I'm going to be more whatever. Well, that wouldn't help a relational process. So that's why you've got to make sure that you really deal with the emotion and the forgiveness and really deal with it correctly. If you don't deal with it correctly, then it's always going to be there between people in relationships, and that's going to not be helpful when it comes to us being of one heart and one mind and one purpose together and everything else. But you got to be real, and I tried to be real about how I've been feeling about things, and look to deal with them. But you go through that process, and restoration is a process. Reconciliation, I can say, let's be reconciled because I've forgiven you. But that doesn't bear the other person may be feeling guilty, or they may feel ashamed. Not that I've made them feel it, but maybe they feel that, which may for them keep a distance, or not really want to pursue that. But as I say, you're only responsible for maintaining peace as much as you're able. You can't make someone else maintain peace with you. But I don't see anyone as an enemy. Even the enemy I don't see as an enemy, because I still see that they are fallen from God's desire and that God still loves them, because God is love. He can't not love them. I know that creates problems for people, and I don't know how that will be outworked or not outworked, but I can't deny the reality of who God is. And therefore, I don't get angry with the enemy. Like some people, well, what does that do? What purpose does that solve? For me, it just makes me angry.
Yeah.
Well, do I want to undo the works of the enemy? Because that's what Jesus came to do. It says he came to undo the works of the enemy. So, of course, I want to see the works of the enemy undone in people's lives and people healed and made whole and restored and all those things that God wants to bring in relationship with us. But I'm not going to take this retributive approach to the enemy, because for me, forgiveness is for everyone and everything. And if I'm in unforgiveness, I'm in unforgiveness. It doesn't say, well, you need to be in forgiveness to these people, but these people it's okay to be in unforgiveness to, or these beings you need to be, for me, a forgiveness is forgiveness. If you don't forgive, you cannot live in forgiveness. So if I'm holding anything against anybody or anything, then that is going to hinder me knowing the forgiveness of God in my life. And that will affect my relationship with him in some negative way. So I don't want to maintain negative things towards anybody or anything.
How we think is like, or what we believe is right. For example, if we go back to something like gratitude, we asked that question. The day before in our group, we debated whether you should have gratitude for every situation. And the end result was basically most people were saying, no, you can't. And then we talked to you, and yes, you can. And it changed how you look for things. And I'm thinking, even when I read a lot of the stuff on our friends in the South of us in the U.S., evangelicals, they'll get on about that godless enemy supporting abortion. They're going to be punished for this and that when God gets through with them. And I think that wrong thinking. See, when I grew up at one time, I would have thought the same thing.
Yeah.
That was as how you turn your thinking. Now I look at it and say, no, it's restoration.
Absolutely. And for me, it's like,
I've got to reprocess this.
Yeah. I mean, I've got to try and look through God's eyes and see people the way God sees them, because then I can be motivated by his desire for them. And when I then look at, you see, part of the problem is people's concepts of this whole subject come from the Bible. That's where most of it comes from. And most of that has been interpreted through theological positions. And therefore, people would find it untenable that God could love the devil.
Yes.
But I come from my experience of God's love, that for me, it would be untenable that he couldn't love the devil. Now, does that mean that he likes what the devil's doing? No. Does it mean he likes what I'm doing when I'm not doing stuff out of love? No. But does it stop him loving? How can it stop him loving if he is love? And therefore, that whole way of looking at it comes out of a deep relationship with love that then changes how you see things, and you're not coming from the traditional way of looking at how God looks at everyone and everything, which is often the retributive type penal way of dealing with things, which isn't how God does it. Everything's restorative from God's perspective. So if you then ask the question, God's desire by revealing our sonship is that creation would be set free from its bondage to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Romans 8. So creation, well, what's creation? Some things that God created, or everything that God created? So if everything God created it's God's desire that it will be set free from corruption, then that must include those that are operating in corruption. Whoever they are, or whatever they are, how can they be excluded from creation? So when I look at the restoration of all things, I link it to God's view of creation, because all things must include creation, and he wants creation to be set free from corruption. So who are in bondage to corruption in creation? Well, everything, in a sense, because everything is affected by the fact that there's an absence of light, and there's an absence of sonship, and there's an absence of the angelic realm, because a third of them left their posts. So there's an absence of who God created them to be in creation, and that's effectively brought negativity. So he wants to set creation free from its corruption. Well, I don't see how that can be just people. No, I don't have any personal experience outside of people, I have to be honest. So I cannot testify to the fact that a fallen angel could be redeemed or restored or reconciled. But I can't rule out the possibility, because of the way I've encountered God and the conversations I've had with him and the way he makes such an emphasis on love. And if creation is going to be in some way set free, that must include everything. And if Jesus died or shed his blood effectively as a sacrifice before the creation, before the foundation of the world, then he built into the fabric of creation the possibility of restored relationship. So would God want to have a restored relationship with a covering cherub who had the most intimate relationship with him? Yes, as far as I'm concerned. Now, would it be reciprocated the other way? I don't know. And I think you can only look at it from the perspective of God's viewpoint. When I was perceivably an enemy of God from my perception, feeling alienated or an enmity or separated, he reached out to me with love. Now, there may be people who have engaged in such a way with the restoration or the reconciliation that goes beyond my experience that I don't know about. But I can't rule out, on the basis of both my knowledge of God and my experience of God, in terms of the full, what love really is. If love keeps no record of wrongs, well, who does that apply to and who it doesn't apply to? No record of wrongs, not some record of wrongs to some, and some that doesn't apply to because they're not encompassed within the cross, because Jesus died for man on the cross as the Son of Man. Well, the cross was just the physical outworking in this dimension of what he did before everything was formed in the first place. So what does that entail? So the more I've got closer to God, the more the love of God and the real depth of that love has been unveiled, and that's changed how I perceive things and people and everything. So for me, I don't think it serves any purpose going around being angry with anybody or anything, because that affects you. It doesn't affect them, but it's affecting you. So be at peace. Don't be at war. Well, we've created a whole thing of spiritual warfare, which is war. Well, where does it say anywhere that Jesus said we should be at war with anybody? It doesn't. It doesn't say we should be at war. But we've developed a huge area of theology within, the last 40 years or so that's about being at war. And I think that then fits into this sort of pattern of it's okay to be angry at the devil, and therefore it's okay to be in unforgiveness towards him because he doesn't deserve forgiveness, and Jesus didn't die for him. Well, who said? And this is part of the dynamic. Who said? Well, this system of belief says that they are destined to be punished forever. But then you look at the words forever and everlasting and eternal, and you realize that it doesn't say that at all. That's just an English interpretation of what's being said. It doesn't say that. It says to the enduring to the age. Well, what does that mean? Is there an age where certain things will end and other things will begin? Some of this is, it is a deep philosophical question which you can't get an answer to without engaging God in a depth of relationship which goes beyond the superficial presumptions and assumptions of I know what the Bible says. Because I thought I knew what the Bible says, and now I realize I don't and didn't. But I would have sworn that I knew what the Bible said, and I would have made that assumption without evidence. And the evidence has come when I've met God and realized I didn't know what the Bible says because it doesn't align with my experience of God in love. Which, is not an easy process. My deconstruction process was not easy. I went through that process, in a real way. I had to weigh the cost of letting go of this and what that might mean. And, it wasn't just an easy thing, but it was such a worthwhile thing because it's freed me from those religious frameworks and constructions which held me to belief systems that didn't come from God. So when he went through this process with me and he said, well, how much of what you know about me and what you know about Christianity and everything comes directly from me, and how much of it has come through other people? A belief system, a theological system, a stream of belief, books, sermons, all of that. How much has that contributed to what you think you know? And I actually had to say most of it. That's the reality. Most of it had. Now he is in my relationship with him basically saying, well, let me show you there's some reality that is going to shake your belief systems. And I think most people are not, I've studied the Bible and I've done all sorts of teaching over the years and years. So I'm pretty familiar with, what the Bible says, but I still have presumed that I understood what it said in context, and I didn't, because God took the real context and unveiled it through him. And that shook me and shook my belief systems so that they collapsed, and it's like, and I'm really glad they did, because now love is my framework, because that's who God is. So I frame life and I frame things around love and not around belief systems which have only come from someone else's interpretation. Now, God has told me things directly, and I trust the things he's told me directly, even if I don't understand them all. And even if I didn't believe them or agree with them initially, it's like, well, I'm now in a rock and hard place. Am I going to hold on to the things I thought I knew, and now I've engaged you, I realize those things aren't true. So what am I going to do? Am I going to let them go? Or hold on to them? Well, what's the point of hold on to them if I no longer believe them? So you have to let them go. But then the knock-on of that is, well, that affects this, and it affects that, and it affects this way of thinking, it affects that way of thinking, it affects that way of behaving. And everything now is changing because I'm not actually framing my behavior out of a belief system which has mostly come, through streams of various teaching I've received over the years, and theological belief systems that coming out of those streams that I've been involved with, which, is very challenging, but deconstruction is absolutely vital if we're going to be able to see the things the way God sees them and really encounter him in that depth. Because, in my journey, even my experiences of him, I was framing and therefore interpreting and understanding through my pre-existing frameworks, until he challenged that and began to unravel that. Because if I am forming an image of God in my own understanding, which I'm leaning to, that's an idol. Because I've created an image of God. God doesn't need an image. He doesn't want an image. What does he want? Relationship. So out of relationship, I live. I don't need to understand that relationship from some external perspective that frames that relationship. Otherwise, that is going to put on that relationship things that relationship aren't really revealing. So it's obviously it's difficult to know when you're doing that, and you just have to trust that God will show you if you're open. And he showed me, and unraveled all of my, images of him, to come back to, why do you want an image? You just need me. You just need a relationship every day. So I don't need to frame that relationship in a theological system. Relationship is relationship. I just need to have it. So if I keep walking with God every day, then that's all I need. I don't need to understand that within a framework of a belief system, because I just walk the relationship out. It didn't say anywhere that God walked with Adam in the cool of the day in the garden according to a belief system. They just walked. They had a relationship. That was the context of everything, the relationship they had. So, this is a process really that is ongoing and continually coming out of relationship, that relationship is still surprising and still has depths that I never even dreamt of. Because how could you, plumb the depths of an infinite God? You just got to keep this mystery there. And I think we need to respect the mystery there, not having to figure it all out or try and understand every detail of everything, because that isn't trust. Relationship needs to be based in trust. Do I trust God even though I don't understand what he does a lot of the time? Yes, because I've worked through that and I've made that choice. I am not going to need to understand to trust you. So if you don't want me to know something, or I don't need to know it, well, then I'm content with that. But what I do need to know is you and your heart. And that really is what I'm focusing on. I want to know the heart of God on a day-to-day basis, heart-to-heart intimacy that will then inform and guide everything that I then think, say, and do. That will come out of his heart, only doing what his heart unveils to me, which for me is the way that God is wanting to teach me to live, that sonship. But you have to work it out in the real world. It doesn't make you immune from situations that go on that you would rather didn't, but do. You have to then apply, well, how am I going to live in love, joy, and peace in the midst of this chaos or this situation, which I really would rather never happened, and that's real. Yeah. Okay, I need to leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was really good.
That was good.
Yeah.